The Haw Wars, also known as the Australian Aboriginal Wars, were a series of conflicts that occurred between British colonizers and the indigenous peoples of Australia, primarily the Haw people, in the mid to late 19th century. The wars were characterized by brutal violence, displacement, and the forced assimilation of Aboriginal communities. The British colonization of Australia began in the late 18th century and was marked by the dispossession and marginalization of Aboriginal peoples. The colonizers brought with them a worldview that saw Aboriginal people as inferior and in need of civilizing. This attitude led to policies of forced assimilation, including the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their families, which became known as the Stolen Generations. The Haw Wars began in the early 1840s when British settlers began to move into the Haw people's traditional lands in what is now Victoria, Australia. The Haw people had a long history of conflict with other neighboring Aboriginal groups, but they were initially welcoming to the British settlers. However, tensions soon arose as the settlers began to encroach on their lands, disrupt their traditional ways of life, and compete for resources. In 1842, a group of Haw people attacked and killed several British settlers in retaliation for the destruction of their crops and hunting grounds. This event marked the beginning of a period of violent conflict that lasted for several decades. The British colonial authorities responded to the Haw attacks with military force. In 1843, a group of British soldiers attacked a Haw camp, killing several people and taking others as prisoners. This attack provoked further retaliation from the Haw, and the conflict continued to escalate. Over the following years, the British colonial authorities pursued a policy of extermination and forced assimilation. This policy involved the use of violence, displacement, and the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their families. The Haw Wars were not an isolated event. Similar conflicts occurred throughout Australia as British colonizers pushed further into Aboriginal lands. The conflicts were often marked by brutal violence and a disregard for the human rights of Aboriginal people. The Haw Wars came to an end in the late 1860s as the British colonial authorities succeeded in suppressing the Haw people's resistance. The wars had a devastating impact on the Haw community, with many people being killed, displaced, or forced to assimilate into European society. The Haw people's traditional lands were also taken over by European settlers, leading to the loss of their culture, language, and way of life. The legacy of the Haw Wars continues to be felt in Australia today. Aboriginal communities continue to suffer from the effects of colonialism, including poverty, discrimination, and social inequality. However, there has also been a growing movement for reconciliation and recognition of the past injustices committed against Aboriginal people. In conclusion, the Haw Wars were a tragic chapter in Australia's history, characterized by violence, displacement, and forced assimilation. The wars were part of a broader pattern of colonialism and oppression that has had a lasting impact on Aboriginal communities. While efforts are being made to address the legacy of colonialism, much more needs to be done to achieve true reconciliation and justice for Aboriginal people in Australia.